The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 teachers in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with the Tennessee academic standards. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu. This video is aligned with the following Tennessee academic standards.
So our session this time around is on using excerpted text. And the reason that we wanted to focus on this is because when you look at the social studies standards, you see, at the end of each of the units, like students are expected to read, and they list a group of sources, and a lot of times they're very lengthy things, and so there's no way that your students are going to read the entirety of those pieces, so you're going to have to excerpt it. So how do we approach excerpting these documents, and how are some ways to think about doing that in a way that will be beneficial to your students when it comes time for them to do the testing? So we're going to kind of talk through some of this and think about it a little bit and figure out what we can do maybe to be more helpful in some of our future resources. So why excerpt? Of course, usually it's text length, right? Your students aren't going to be able to read 5 novels in the space of 1 unit. Unfortunately, they don't read that much, right? Vocabulary. If you're doing the early part of U.S. history, there are lots of very difficult, archaic language in some of those documents that are going to be very, very difficult for your students. Text complexity. A lot of this stuff wasn't written for students, right? Unfortunately, we're not writing our founding documents for our 4th and 8th graders to be able to read. They were written, by highly educated men for other highly educated men. So text complexity is definitely an issue. And then lastly is classroom time management. Like, you just don't have time to cover the entirety of all of these sources that, yes, we would ideally love our students to read all of them, but it's just not realistic. So when we think about these reasons, and I use the Federalist Papers here because Stacy and I have been on a kick with these the last few months, and that we have discovered a true love for the Federalist Papers, but man, we feel bad for the poor kids who have to read these at the grade level they have to read them. So how do we choose what to excerpt? So how do we figure out, when it says that your students should read the U.S. Constitution or they should read the Declaration of Independence, what part of that do we want them to read? What's the best part? And so there's some questions that we want to think about to help us maybe determine what that is. First off, we want to think about what do we want the students to take away from the reading? What is as the educator, what is our overall goal for the students to be able to do at the conclusion of the lesson? So that's the first thing we want to think about. What do we want them to walk away with? Second thing we want to think about, is there a key passage, a sentence, a phrase in this document that is so well known that it's basically just connected? So when it says Declaration of Independence, is there a phrase in that we all think about? And if so, our excerpt should probably include that phrase. So we want to think about that question. And then next we want to think about what are the core themes, arguments, and main ideas of the text. So basically whatever excerpt we pick, can it boil down what that key point is to the document that the student would be able to understand the entirety of it to some extent by only having read a small portion of it. So what portion of it can we pull out that basically will hit on the core theme, the core argument, or the main idea of the text? And so the American Crisis, again, another one of those text documents that students are expected to read for the first half of U.S. history. So when I thought about those 3 questions, this is the portion of it that I come to. So the piece that I would select for this is, these are the times that try men's souls. Right, that is the phrase in the American Crisis that's most well known. So any excerpt that we were going to use of that needs to include that phrase, right? So the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives us everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its good, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. That's still pretty long for our 4th grade students, right? But for our 8th grade students, we could probably pick that apart and use that piece there to, again, get at those core things that we're thinking about. What we want students to walk away with, of course, is the core idea of the document, and this kind of speaks to that, is that time of crisis with the revolution, and that we think about that first sentence and really this last one, that we think about that freedom should not be so highly rated, right? That we have to make sure that people value it, right? That it's not something that we just throw away. And so that this passage really kind of begins to get to those key points. So after we have went through and kind of thought about those questions, the next thing we want to think about is, how am I going to structure this? So if I'm selecting my excerpt, are all the students going to read the same piece? So if they're going to read the same piece, that means that you're going to have to boil it down to just one piece. Now, if you're going to have students reading different pieces, maybe you can pick out 4 or 5 short passages. Or maybe we could have taken a passage like we just looked at and pulled that out and just give them part of the phrases in that. And so have them work through it in kind of a round robin type fashion. And then how are you going to use it in classroom instruction? So the example that I want to use for kind of how we've thought about this, I did a newsletter lesson idea a couple months back on federalism, which, interestingly, federalism is for like key concept, but the word doesn't actually appear in any of our founding documents, right? Which I think is interesting. So if we were going to teach what federalism is, looking at the Constitution, again, our 4th and 8th graders probably aren't going to be able to tackle the entirety of the Constitution. Our high school U.S. government kids probably aren't going to be able to tackle the entirety of the Constitution. So how do we select some document or some portions from the Constitution that can help us to teach federalism? So what I did with this one, so this was in our civic education newsletter. So I went through and actually selected about 5 or 6 different excerpts to use. So pulling out some of the different sections from the Constitution that can begin to speak to this concept. And so having students work in small groups, so putting them in about 4 or 5 groups, and having the groups work through those sections so that they can figure out what does this tell us about the division of power within the federal government based on the Constitution. And so that each group would then work through that small portion in order to be able to answer this larger question without having to actually every group read all of these different sections. So thinking about that way, that you can come out and actually pull out portions of that. So for example, one section is actually having them read part of Section 8, which lays out the powers of the Congress. This is one of the longer sections within the Constitution, and so it lists out, I think there's about 20 different powers that are, or charges that are given to Congress. So probably having one group tackle all of those responsibilities is still a little much, especially because, again, the language, the way it's worded, they're probably going to have some trouble with that. But you could probably break it down and give them 5 or 6 and have them begin to work through those to think about, again, what are we saying that the legislature has the power to do. So thinking about, again, how we break it up. Do we have them all read one thing, or do we do this in small groups? When you all do activities with your students, what's your experience trying to have small groups reading different things? How successful has that been for you all?
Depends on what they do.
Okay.
Well, I did an activity like that right before school was out. It was on World War I. And I gave them these primary sources that I found, and I put them in like 5 different groups, and there was 4 in a group, and they had different questions they had to answer. They all had the same packet, so when that group basically went through and read it and talked about it to the class and answered the questions that were there, the class could follow along with them, but they didn't have to do those particular questions. And they were all on primary sources.
Okay.
And they enjoyed it. They enjoyed presenting. They had their own primary sources to read. They talked about it. I gave them time to talk about it. And then they presented it to the class. But they didn't get up. They were just sitting in their seat. But everybody could follow along with them and write. And I had them write down the answers, take notes to what they said. So I thought it went well.
And that's what, that presentation piece is very key, because if they're just getting a grade for it, they're not in. If they're just seeing it on a test, they're not in. But put them up in front of the class, teaching it to everybody else, they're in.
Well, and that's where actually, when we're thinking about connecting it to those larger skill sets that I talked about in my first session this morning, having the student groups present their learning to others works in some other great skill sets, because they're having to summarize what they learned and then actually present that in a way that they can, can share it. Which, we know from our learning strategies, like that means that they're going to have to understand it on a deeper level so that they can share it with others. So if you can get your students to approach it that way, it is a really good way for them to teach each other, really. And you can grasp really the level of their comprehension, because if the group didn't understand it, when they go to present it to others, it's going to become very clear that they didn't quite catch what you were hoping they would get out of it. Anyone else have ways that you have approached doing group work like that?
The same thing, except within the group, if they've learned all about this particular excerpt, they will be part of a master group. So like, if there's 4 in this group doing this, then one of each of those will go back to another group and disseminate the information, so that they're all having to learn one key part of the whole. And that helps as well.
So what we're going to do is we're actually going to look through a source. We're actually going to be using Lincoln's second inaugural address. Again, it's one of those required readings. It's one that I like to use, and it's a good one because it's long enough that you can excerpt it, but it's not so long that it will take you forever to get through all of it. I've actually done one of these recently with some Dr. King speeches, but they're a little longer, so I wasn't sure we'd have time to get through all of them. Not to mention they're not Library of Congress sources, so technically I'm not supposed to use them in workshops. What we are going to do is working at your table groups. We're going to have you guys read this, and I want you, we're going to look at excerpting from 3 different perspectives. So first, I want you to focus on excerpting to focus on teaching the main idea of the speech. So if you were going to teach just the main idea of the speech, what portion would you pull out? Then I want you to think about excerpting for significant phrases. So if you were just wanting to pull out kind of the key phrases, what pieces would you pull? And lastly, I want you to excerpt it to address the question, what can we deduce about Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction from his second inaugural address? So if we were going to just try to answer that question, what portion would you have students to read? All right, so I should... So first we want to excerpt it to focus on just teaching the main idea of the speech. Last paragraph? Any other portions that you would pick to focus on just the main idea? The second paragraph. The second paragraph?
It seeks to kind of set the stage of the grade. I mean, the main idea of this is that, we got stuck in this war, therefore we need to move past what happened. So I think it's important to read that second one, because it serves to remind the students, okay, this is what Lincoln says happened, and then to move on and read like the first. I mean, I'm coming at this from a high school perspective, and like I said, it's a little bit longer, but the first probably 3 sentences of the third paragraph.
Okay.
And if I were to excerpt this for an AP class, if I wasn't going to have them read the whole thing, I would probably excerpt that
Okay. So.
for the main idea.
Okay. Someone else. So with the last paragraph you selected, why did you pick it to focus on the main idea?
Because it talks about, this is what he wants. This is he wants to achieve this, to pretty much heal the wounds, essentially, so I see it.
Okay. It's kind of the goals going forward for his second term.
The only thing is, if you just do the last paragraph, you're not setting the stage for why are we binding up the wounds with malice toward none. You'd have to talk about that second paragraph, or even into the third paragraph, talking about if we shall suppose American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time he now wills to remove. Like, you need to understand, I mean, he's saying in here, slavery is the reason for all this. So the main idea is that slavery happened, it's over with now, we gotta move on. And he's telling the South, you did this war because of slavery. Of course, they would have argued with him mightily on that case.
Actually, not during the time period.
Not at the time, but once the lost cause hits, yes. But, I mean, that's where, I think that you've got to put that. You can't just, that goes into the second one too, the significant phrase is with malice toward none and with charity toward all. That's what everybody knows from the second inaugural.
Yes.
Well, okay. If you know the second inaugural, you know that one. So you need to be able to, they need to be able to read the explanation for it.
Okay.
It's probably why I suck at excerpting things, because I think it's all important.
Well, so there is that. So, and especially if you get into documents that you yourself really love. Then it's even harder because you're like, but it's all good. They should read all of it, right? They should appreciate all of it the way I do. And unfortunately, our students don't always agree with us on that. So I think that what you did though there is one way of approaching it. So if we actually, instead of just taking one section, so if we just take one piece, maybe we take a piece here and a piece down here. And so that instead of just pulling out one section, we're giving them small snippets from in the entirety of the document. And a lot of times, especially for longer pieces, that may work better because you're going to get that they're laying the case as to why, the statements that they're making. So here, why Lincoln said that, we found ourselves in this war, the cause of the war, and now what we're going to do going forward. And so if you pulled out those 3 bits, you get those 3 core ideas within the document. Anyone have a different piece that they felt was something they would want to have their students read to get at main idea? So significant phrases. So aside from our with malice toward none, do we have another significant phrase or piece in there that you would have your students read?
Well, something that you've heard, both read the same Bible, pray to the same God, each invokes blah, blah, blah. That's used over and over in the civil rights movement. Over and over.
Yeah, which gets actually at another good point when you're thinking about excerpting documents. So when we have a document that we know is going to connect to something later on, that we can begin to draw those connections throughout our history, that it's important that we introduce that when we initially cover it, so that we can remind our students later on, remember when we read that, now we have someone who's actually hearkening back to that. So we see that here, Declaration of Independence, we see that one referenced multiple times in multiple different places around the world. So if you were just sitting in on Dr. Sayward's lecture, she talked about how Ho Chi Minh actually used that to declare Vietnamese independence. We know if we look at Declaration of Sentiments, the people who wrote that actually structured that along the Declaration of Independence. So again, it's where if we pick up those key phrases, so when students see that later on, they will be able to draw those connections. So when we think about excerpting to address a specific question, so if our question, if we were looking at, when we were looking at Lincoln's inaugural address, was basically what we can figure out about Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction based on what he says here, what piece would you have your students read?
Those were up to the last paragraph.
Last paragraph? Yeah. So, that's something to think about. When you're constructing your lesson, you think about whatever your core investigative question is. You want to make sure that what piece you're pulling is going to help students to be able to address that question. And again, it might be different than what the main idea of the text is. It may be different than a significant phrase from the text. But if there is a core piece that will help to answer that question, that might help to shape what it is that you're excerpting. The other piece, of course, here is we want to make sure that students can place all this into context. So that kind of goes back to what I talked about in my first section. If we think about the historical context for these documents and we give students that piece before we actually have them to read whatever you're excerpting, if they can remember of course, who was President Lincoln? Why was it important that he was, elected again? And why is it important he's making this speech at this point in time? What else is going on? And that way that they can, whatever piece of it they read, even if they see a different portion later on in something else they're reading or on a test, they can at least draw back to that connection that you've given them the context for. Oops. So once we've kind of selected our excerpt, we want to think about, are there supports that we need to put into place? Because so oftentimes with these documents, if we're thinking about vocabulary or text complexity, there may be other things that we need to build in there, especially when we think about reading supports. So is there vocabulary that we need to help our students with prior to them actually looking at the document? Do we need to just reword or rephrase the bit that we're having students to read? And especially if you're working with 4th and 5th grade students, that might be something that you want to think about. Is it something that you need to rephrase a bit to help them to be able to get at the main crux of what the excerpt is saying before you actually show them the original language? And you'll see a lot of, I know our partners who are at the Stanford History Education Group, they're one of their TPS partners, they do that a lot with their materials. They will rephrase things. And we have started doing that on some of our stuff as well because, again, some of this language is just, it's too difficult, and if you have students who are struggling readers, they're going to shut down on you pretty quickly. So if you think about kind of how we can reword, rephrase it. And actually, I have been working on a lesson plan on Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment, and we went in and did that with Andrew Johnson's the statement that he put out about amnesty, and so kind of rewording and rephrasing that to make that a little easier for students because there's a lot of text for them to get through in that document, so trying to make that a little bit easier. Context. Again, I mentioned context before. Are students going to have the context they need in order to be able to look at to place the document within that larger time frame, or are you going to need to actually provide them a little bit of support there? And you might want to give them an overall summary of the piece that you're looking at, especially if you're looking at a novel or something like that. I know like Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, is one of the required texts for the first half of U.S. history, and so maybe that's one where you need to give them a synopsis of the overall plot for the novel before you give them an excerpt so that they understand what it is that the whole piece gets at. And so, when we think about these things, I pulled out just a piece. This is from the introduction from Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois. And so this is one that I think kind of gets at some of these. And so we think about kind of those reading supports, and, vocabulary. One of the things that to think about is there's some phrase that's unique. So when we think about Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois talks a lot about the veil. Now that is something, if your students, an initial go around are not going to understand probably what he is referencing when he talks about the veil. And so that might be something before you ever gave a piece to your students that you actually need to sit down and discuss. What is he talking about here? What does that mean? And especially in context of when he is writing this in the early 1900s. When we think about race relations and segregation and Jim Crow, and so how to put that into context so that when they read this bit that they can begin to understand the point that he is getting at. Du Bois is another good example. Like, you might want to try to rephrase some of his, because just the way he structures his sentences, his language is a little flowery at times, and again can be a little difficult for our younger students to kind of to work through. So you might want to think about kind of picking shorter pieces and kind of working through it. So if we talk about the veil, I'd want to talk to my students about what he means by essentially the color line. Essentially, and we think about the divisions within segregated society, and that essentially was almost a physical presence, and that's what he is talking about here. Other strategies that you all use when working through text excerpts, supports that you've put in place, things that you've tried with your students to help them work through.
Well, I taught Shakespeare to high school students for 17 years, I'm going to tell you, you better have some strategies.
Yes.
Talk about rewording and rephrasing. I would choose like a scene or something and have them rephrase it.
Yes.
Have them dig into it. And it takes a while.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to have the resources for them to be able to do it, but they can do it.
We have, in one of our lesson plans for 8th grade, we have done that with some of, I think with James Madison's writings. I think it's Madison. Because, yeah, it's difficult stuff, but it's wondering if students can kind of reword it in their own language, you can really begin to get how much of it they're comprehending. It takes some time, though, yeah. But yeah, Shakespeare. I didn't like Shakespeare so much in high school. It was too difficult.
My teacher used to point out all the places where Shakespeare was body. Because he had a really dirty sense of humor.
Never had to do that.
So here's an example of Shakespeare's body sense of humor.
So other strategies, supports that you guys have used.
Vocabulary, that definitely stops them. Just having them go through and take a highlighter and mark out every word they don't really know. Mm-hmm. It's amazing some of the things that they don't understand.
Yeah, having them go through that, sometimes doing that on the first run, especially if you want them to reread it multiple times. If you do that the first time around, you can work through some of those phrases, and then next time around, give them a different kind of purpose in reading the next time around.
And I do, before I even start Shakespeare, I do pedantic proverbs. They have to go through and figure out what it is and all. And they've come to realize I don't have to know every word. Mm-hmm. I don't even have to know part of every word. I can pick up 2 or 3 words here, and then I can, when the light bulb goes on, I can figure out what it says. And that just builds their confidence to deal with the difficult texts. As they realize, actually, I know more than I think I do. I see all these big words and it scares me, but I don't need to be scared. I need to be.
Well, and in thinking about building their confidence, and especially when we think about our younger students, I think if we preface a lot of these lessons with reminding the students that who were the people writing these things? They were not written for 7, 8, 9-year-olds. And so reminding them that at first, don't be alarmed if this is confusing. It should be confusing to you. And so I think to preface that is a good way to help to build their confidence and to know that, again, it's kind of it's a team exercise, right? We're all going to work through this together. There are many adults who still struggle with understanding some of those, kind of key pieces in these documents. And so to know that our students are really kind of working much above their, their age level, I think can help to bolster their confidence in attacking the stuff. So we have, of course, lots of different activities that we have done on our site using excerpted text. And so I've pulled out just a couple examples that I wanted to reference to you. So one, looking at using multiple text sources. So if you want to do an activity where your kids are going to be looking at multiple texts, then of course, having them go through and, let's see this one. So this one, we're looking at main idea, revolutionary documents. And so, there's no way that we would actually have our students to read all of these. So what we did is we actually devised this worksheet that you could use with your students. So we pulled an excerpt from Common Sense, and then pulled an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence, and then one from the American Crisis. And just looking at these kind of 3 key passages from these documents, what we would have students do in looking at them is try to translate this into their own words, right? So try to pull from these documents the core ideas and to explain that in their own words here. So again, giving them 3 short pieces from these key documents, all of which are again referenced as documents that you're supposed to be able to read. So that's kind of one way to do it, and so you can do kind of a compare and contrast. Then you could talk about how these documents overlap and how they build off of each other. Novels. I mentioned there are several novels that are listed as required readings in social studies. So we did one, and if you teach Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Library of Congress actually has a really neat resource that is a children's version of Uncle Tom's Cabin that's available on their digitized books on read.gov. And so we have this lesson idea from a couple years ago where we actually went through and pulled out 6 excerpts from that children's version of the book. So the language is actually already kind of a little bit easier than the original version. And then the library has some other great resources, like some posters and things that were done that you could also use. But again, thinking about how do we start with, what we start with when we're looking at novels, and we want to begin with giving them, of course, the context for it, giving them the overall plot, so that whatever piece that your students are exposed to, they can put that into the bigger picture of what the work is about. So if you're only reading, one small piece, not even a full chapter, that they can understand how that fits into the larger story of the novel. Because again, we're probably not going to have time for our students to read all of the books that are referenced. So that's one way to approach doing novels. The other thing, especially if you're working with students who are struggling readers, are pairing excerpts with other types of sources. So we have this lesson plan that we have done a lot in our civics education workshops called Goals of Government. And in this one, we actually take the preamble to the Constitution, so just pulling that bit is the only actual, is the key text for this lesson plan. And what we're wanting students to be able to do here is to figure out what are the stated goals of the federal government and how are they accomplished. And so having them work through those 6 goals and actually working as a group to define what those goals mean. And then we give the students 6 different sources, most of which are visuals. We do have 2 short excerpted text, and have them figure out which of those goals those different sources speak to. So, for example, this is one of the sources they look at. This poster here that talks about our Bill of Rights is everybody's business, and it says trial by jury. So having the students look at that visual and figure out what that tells us about what goal that the government would be accomplishing with that as stated in the preamble. So when you pair these different types of sources together, again, it's a way to get your struggling readers to give them a chance to access sources in a different way. So again, that's some different ways we have approached excerpting text. Questions, thoughts on other ways that you have approached using text?
You have to do it with later on stuff, like you can't do it with Abraham Lincoln here, but any sort of video or recorded, like I do, like man on the street interviews with Pearl Harbor stuff. FDR is great for that. Martin Luther King would be very good. But at least I teach high school U.S. history, and it at least grasps their attention to something other than their phone. And obviously it's also good to give them a transcript of because oftentimes, and I'll pause it and I guess I would teach the excerpt like, all right, they said this is what they're referring to. Maybe I'll put it in historical context there, or I'll do historical context before and say, all right, see if you can catch it within what we're talking about. But having something other than just reading it helps.
Yes. Yeah, especially you do later U.S. or late 20th century, you can bring in video and audio, and that is definitely a great way to work that in.
Great when you hit FDR. And you can, and then we also put in the historical context, and you see like him doing the December 7th, 1941 speech, and you say, look at his hands on the podium. What does he do? So you can bring in the fact that, he had polio, and you can talk about, and I've actually got a CD of radio broadcasts from Honolulu on December 7th, 1941. I picked up when I was in Pearl Harbor a couple of years ago, and that is powerful stuff, because the kids are just like, even though there's no pictures, at least they can listen.
If you can bring in those type of sources, that is wonderful. A lot of times we've been focusing on the early stuff because of,
and even with the early stuff, I found it's actors. It's Whoopi Goldberg and people like that are reading the Declaration of Independence. They do a choral reading, and pieces are read by some. Sometimes they're all reading together, and it's just it's an amazing
That
thing.
one is very powerful.
It is. It just almost brings a tear to your eye.
So that's
Beautiful. That's what it is.
How many of you guys do Constitution Day in your schools?
Well, we have, when he doesn't get too busy and forget to say, hey, get something ready for Constitution Day.
I did in South Carolina.
So, here on campus, we have the American Democracy Project, and for a while they were actually housed in our department. But one thing that they do on campus every year that I think is really neat is that they have readings of the Constitution, and so that they do it as a choral reading. Like everyone reads a small section, but it's really, it's powerful to have people work through it, and it's interesting, especially here in a college environment. You still get to those portions where the vocabulary is difficult. And it's okay that we have people that are kind of struggling through it, because again, we're all reading the Constitution, and so it's a good reminder of kind of what's in it. And so, I think about doing some kind of programming like that in your school, especially around Constitution Day. And I'm sure that Dr. Evans, who is the coordinator for that here on campus, would be happy to talk to you about resources.
Your theater department have professional actors like this, and they're actors. They can do what we call a dramatic reading.
And there are several living history performers that are around in Middle Tennessee that work with different school groups. I know there's a guy who does Abraham Lincoln. There's several who do kind of Civil War figures. There are some folks who are, as the Women's Suffrage Centennial comes up, I'm sure we'll be seeing some more of those folks. There's a guy who does Grant that's really good. So you have those kind of resources too that are out there that might be worth exploring if you wanted to bring them into your school and have them do a program. But the guy who does Lincoln, who's been around for a while, he's really good. Yeah, he's really good. He's a really nice guy. Yeah. Other thoughts on excerpting text resources? Well, as you guys go forward, if you have suggestions, things that you would like to see resources developed around, whether it be specific text that you're having to teach, please let me know, because again, we devise a lot of our materials in our workshops based on teacher suggestions, and so I'm always happy to hear what you guys are in need of.